The rain fell like judgment that night, heavy, relentless, cold enough to strip the warmth from bone and leave nothing behind but the quiet. Creeping certainty that the world had decided you no longer deserved to exist within it. London in the small hours of a November morning was not a city. It was a verdict, and Lady Amelia Holt lay crumpled in the mud of a narrow alley off Whitmore Street, bleeding into the cobblestones, listening to the sound of her own breathing as though it was something fragile she needed to protect. A candle flame in a storm, guttering, stubborn, not yet extinguished. Her ribs screamed with every inhale. Her right temple had met the edge of a stone wall with enough force to blur the edges of her vision. Her dress, once the deep green of a woman who still believed she had a future, was now soaked black with rain and darker still at the side where one of Whitehead's men had pressed a blade. Not deep enough to kill her immediately, deep enough to make dying feel like the simpler option. But Lady Amelia Holt had never chosen the simpler option, not once in her 24 years on this earth, and she did not choose it now. Her fingers, cold, trembling, crusted at the knuckles where she had fought back with everything she had, curled tighter around the leather-bound ledger pressed against her chest. She would not let go. She could not let go. Inside those water-stained pages lived the only truth that still mattered in all of England. The truth about her brother. The truth about his death. The truth about the man who had smiled at his funeral and wept public tears while privately counting the inheritance he had stolen with ink and forgery and the quiet efficiency of a man who had done this kind of thing before. Lord Brooks Whitehead, her guardian, her betrayer, the architect of everything she had lost. She had found the ledger 6 days ago, tucked behind a false panel in Whitehead's private study, the kind of hiding place that only a man supremely confident in his own untouchability would choose. Confident that no ward, no woman, no orphaned lady of diminished circumstances would ever dare look, would ever dare know. He had miscalculated. She had run the same night, with nothing but the clothes on her back, the ledger beneath her arm, and the names of 2 people in London she believed she could still trust. The first had turned her away at the door, pale-faced and trembling, unwilling to be connected to anything that bore Whitehead's shadow. The second had listened, nodded, offered her tea, and then quietly sent word to Whitehead's men before the cup had cooled. That was 3 hours ago. They had found her near the river. There had been 4 of them. She had run until her lungs gave out and her legs stopped obeying. She had fought until fighting was no longer physically possible. And then the alley had swallowed her, and the rain had closed over her like a curtain. And Lord Whitehead himself had crouched down beside her in the mud, close enough that she could smell the brandy on his breath and the particular cologne he wore to Parliament. He had looked at her the way a man looks at a problem he is about to solve permanently. "You were always too curious, Amelia," he had said, almost gently. The way one speaks to a child who has broken something valuable. It's a terrible quality in a woman. He had reached for the ledger. She had held on. He had nodded to his men. After that there was pain, and then there was the rain, and then there was the alley, and then there was the nothing that wasn't quite nothing of a consciousness refusing to fully surrender. She did not know how much time had passed. She knew the ledger was still in her hands. She knew she was still breathing. She knew that somewhere above the clouds, her brother Nathan was either watching or he wasn't. And either way, she intended to make sure his death meant something before she joined him. "Hold on," she told herself. "Hold on." And then she heard footsteps, not the frantic, splashing footsteps of a man in a hurry, not the heavy, deliberate tread of someone who had been sent to finish what Whitehead's men had started. These were measured, unhurried, the footsteps of a man who owned every surface he walked upon, including rain-soaked cobblestones in forgotten London alleyways at 3 in the morning. A lantern light swept across the ground. Amelia turned her face toward it the way a dying plant turns toward the last available sun. The light stopped moving, silence, only rain, then a voice, low, controlled. The kind of voice that did not raise itself because it had never needed to. Joshua. A second set of footsteps, quicker, came forward. Your Grace. A pause. She's alive, I can see that, the first voice again. Closer now. The lantern shifted. Who did this? Unknown. Another pause. Longer this time. Amelia felt rather than saw the man crouch down beside her, a presence like a change in atmospheric pressure, like the moment before lightning decides where to strike. She forced her eyes to focus. What she saw was a face that belonged to no one's idea of a rescuer. Sharp angles, dark eyes that reflected the lantern light without warmth and without fear. A jaw set with the permanent tension of a man who made decisions for a living and had long since stopped agonizing over them. He was perhaps 40, perhaps older, the kind of man whose age had settled into him like iron cooling into a mold, hard, precise, permanent. He was looking at the ledger, not at her wounds, not at her face. At the ledger she held crushed against her chest with both arms wrapped around it, with her broken fingers and her failing strength and her absolute, unwavering refusal to release it. Even now, even here, even at the very bottom of everything. Something moved behind his eyes. Something that was not quite pity and not quite recognition, but lived in the narrow, significant space between the two. His man, Joshua, broad-shouldered, with the careful eyes of someone trained to assess threats rather than feel them, reached forward to lift the ledger from her arms. Amelia's grip tightened. Even now, even at the absolute end of herself, she held on. Joshua looked up at his employer. The Duke of Blackwell looked down at Amelia for a long, unreadable moment. Then, with a quietness that somehow carried more authority than a shout, "Leave it." He removed his coat, dark wool, heavy and warm, still carrying the heat from his body. He placed it over her with a care that seemed almost involuntary, as if his hands had decided before his mind gave permission. When he spoke again, his voice did not soften. But it did something more useful. It became absolute. "From this moment on," said the Duke of Blackwell, "no one touches you without my permission." And for the first time in 6 days, Lady Amelia Holt allowed herself to stop fighting, just for a moment. Just long enough to be carried. Blackwell Manor did not welcome you. It assessed you. Even in her half-conscious state, draped in the Duke's coat and transported through London's dark streets in a carriage that moved with the swift, unquestioned efficiency of a vehicle nobody dared impede, Amelia was aware of the estate the way one is aware of a cathedral, not through observation but through atmosphere, through the particular quality of silence that large, powerful things cast around themselves. She was brought inside by firelight. She was aware of warmth, of hands that were competent rather than gentle, medical rather than emotional, of a woman's voice, low and assured, issuing instructions, of the ledger still pressed against her chest, which nobody attempted to remove a second time. She slept. She dreamed of Nathan. He was 12 years old in the dream, running through the grounds of Holt House with his boots unlaced and his laughter trailing behind him like ribbon, turning back to look at her with the particular delight of a boy who believed the world was built for his enjoyment and had not yet been given reason to believe otherwise. She woke up crying. The room was pale gold with morning light. A fire burned in a grate carved from dark stone. The ceiling was high, coffered, serious in its architecture, the ceiling of a room that had never been intended for guests. that had been requisitioned and prepared with efficiency rather than hospitality. The ledger lay on the bedside table. She reached for it before she reached for water. "It's all there," she startled. In a chair near the window, half in shadow despite the morning, sat the Duke of Blackwell. He had not slept, or if he had done so somewhere else and returned before she woke. He was watching her with those dark, assessing eyes, a glass of something amber untouched on the table beside him, his posture carrying the particular stillness of a man who was accustomed to waiting and had never confused waiting with weakness. "I had Mrs. Gable check the pages when they dried," he continued. Nothing was lost. Amelia sat up slowly, aware of the bandages at her ribs, the careful dressing at her temple, the bruising that had declared itself across her arms and collarbone in purples and yellows she could feel without looking. She looked at him. He looked back. "You're the Duke of Blackwell," she said. "Yes. You found me. You were in my territory." Said without elaboration, as if this explained everything, perhaps. She would come to understand it did. She absorbed this. "Why did you bring me here?" "Because leaving you there was not something I was willing to do." A pause. Minimal, precise. "And because whoever put you in that alley did so with considerable confidence that they would not face consequences. I find that confidence interesting." "Whitehead," she said. The name landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Blackwell's expression did not change. But something beneath it did. A fractional shift. The tightening of something that had already been tight. "Lord Brooks Whitehead, my guardian." She reached for the ledger, pressed her hand flat against its cover. "He murdered my brother. Forged the inheritance documents. The ledger proves it. All of it." She met his eyes directly. "It also proves he bribed 3 judges, purchased 2 parliamentary titles through fraudulent means, and sold military intelligence to parties who are not friends of England." Silence. Outside the window, London was waking into grey November light, indifferent to the fact that in this room, in this conversation, the architecture of a powerful man's destruction was being quietly assembled. Blackwell leaned forward, set his elbows on his knees, looked at her with the focused attention of a man who had spent decades separating truth from performance, and had become exceptionally good at it. "Tell me about your brother," he said, and something in the way he said it. Not tell me about the evidence, or tell me about Whitehead, but tell me about your brother, made Amelia's throat tighten in a way that had nothing to do with her injuries. She told him. Nathan Holt had been 22 years old and brilliant and stubborn and prone to staying up until dawn reading histories of civilizations that no longer existed, because he believed, with the particular conviction of a young man not yet fully acquainted with grief, that the past always had something useful to teach the present. He had inherited the Holt estate at 19 when their father died. The land, the income, the responsibilities, and the guardian their father had appointed in his will, with the absolute trust of a man who did not know what Brooks Whitehead truly was. For 3 years Nathan had managed, learned, grown into the shape of the man he was becoming, and then he had started asking questions about the estate accounts. And then he had stopped asking questions. And then he had died. A riding accident. That was what the death certificate said. That was what Whitehead had told the coroner, the magistrate, the vicar who buried him, and the small congregation of mourners who gathered in the rain to say goodbye to a young man whose horse had apparently thrown him on a stretch of road he had ridden 100 times before without incident. Amelia had been 21, recently returned from a year in Bath, where Whitehead had arranged for her education to be completed, conveniently removing her from the estate during the period of Nathan's growing suspicion. She had not believed the accident. She had not been able to prove otherwise. For 2 years she had lived under Whitehead's guardianship, a grown woman trapped in the amber of legal dependency, smiling at dinners and attending church and performing the perfect obedience of someone who was, underneath every polished surface, slowly and methodically looking for the truth. She had found it 6 days ago. She had run, she had nearly died, and now she was here. Blackwell listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, the room held the specific quality of silence that follows something important. Waited, still demanding to be respected, he stood, crossed to the window, looked out at the city below with his hands clasped behind his back, and Amelia watched his reflection in the glass and saw something pass across his face that he had not permitted to reach the rest of him. "Whitehead will know you survived by tonight," he said finally. "My presence in that alley will be reported to him by morning. If it hasn't been already, I know he will come for you." "I know." He turned from the window, looked at her across the room with an expression that was not quite decision and not quite resolve, but something older than both. Something that had been made before this moment, in a different time, in a different grief, and was only now finding its proper application. "Then he will find you here," said the Duke of Blackwell, "and he will discover what it costs a man to harm someone under my protection." He moved toward the door. "Rest. Eat. Mrs. Gable will see to everything you need." He paused at the threshold. "The ledger doesn't leave this floor." "It doesn't leave my hands," Amelia corrected quietly. He looked back at her, and for the first time, the absolute corner of something that might have been approval crossed the Duke of Blackwell's face. "Then we understand each other," he said. And he was gone. She learned the estate in stages. Mrs. Gable, small, precise, with silver hair and eyes that had seen enough of life to stop being surprised by most of it, became her guide and her guardian within the house's walls. She brought meals and medicines and, occasionally, information delivered in the manner of a woman who had worked for the Duke long enough to understand that useful intelligence was always welcome and idle gossip was not. "He doesn't take guests," Mrs. Gable told her on the 3rd morning, arranging a breakfast tray with the focused care of someone who believed that food properly presented was a form of respect. "In 11 years, I have prepared this room for a guest precisely once. A man from the Foreign Office. He stayed 4 hours and left looking considerably paler than when he arrived." "And now?" Amelia asked. Mrs. Gable set down the teapot and looked at her directly. "And now I have prepared it for you, and His Grace has instructed me that you are to have whatever you require for as long as you require it." A pause, significant. In 11 years, he has never said "as long as you require it" to anyone. Amelia absorbed this with the particular care of someone learning a new landscape. She healed with the focused determination she brought to everything. She ate, she slept, she read through the ledger's pages again and again until its contents were mapped in her memory with the precision of a sworn legal statement. Every entry, every date, every damning line of Whitehead's precise, unhurried handwriting recording his crimes with the casual confidence of a man who had never once considered accountability. Nathan Holt removed, problem resolved, estate transferred. 8 words, written in the same neat hand as the household accounts that surrounded them. As if her brother's life had been a minor administrative matter, a line item, a problem resolved. She sat with that for a long time, let it settle into the bedrock of her grief, where it hardened into something new. Something that was not despair, something that was purpose. Captain Joshua came to her on the 5th day. He was younger than she had initially estimated, perhaps 32, with the careful, watchful quality of a man trained to notice everything and volunteer nothing. He carried himself with military precision and regarded her with the frank, assessing gaze of someone determining whether she was an asset or a complication. "His Grace would like to know," Joshua said, standing just inside the doorway with his hat in his hands, "if you would be willing to walk him through the ledger's contents in detail. He has people working, but he wants your account." "His people," Amelia said. "Who are they?" "People who can move through the parts of London that official channels cannot reach." She considered this. "What is he planning?" Joshua met her gaze steadily. "To make sure Whitehead never has the opportunity to harm anyone again." She stood, straightened her spine against the protest of her healing ribs, picked up the ledger. "Take me to him," she said. "The Duke's study was a room that told you everything about the man who occupied it. If you knew how to read rooms the way some people read faces. It was large without being ostentatious. Every surface held something functional: maps, correspondence, documents organized with a system that appeared chaotic and was certainly not. Books filled the walls not for decoration but for use, their spines cracked and their pages marked. A globe stood in the corner that had been touched enough to show it. On the desk, 3 separate matters appeared to be in active progress simultaneously. Blackwell stood when she entered. She noticed that, filed it away. He gestured to the chair across from his desk and waited until she was seated before sitting himself. Then he looked at the ledger and back at her. "From the beginning," he said. She talked for 2 hours. He listened with the absolute, undivided attention of a man for whom listening was a skill honed to the level of weaponry. He interrupted 3 times, not to redirect or dismiss, but to ask precise, clarifying questions that told her he was building something in his mind as she spoke, constructing a structure from the materials she provided. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then, the signed confession, the entry about your brother. "The last page," she said, "3rd entry from the bottom." He opened the ledger to it. "Read the 8 words. Set the ledger down with a care that was almost ceremonial." "He wrote this himself," Blackwell said. "He was supremely confident no one would ever read it." "He was wrong." "He was wrong," Amelia agreed. Blackwell stood, moved to the window. She was beginning to understand this as a habit, a need to look outward when processing inward, and stood with his back to her for a long moment. "My sister," he said, "was 20 years old when she died." Amelia went very still. She had uncovered information about a man in a position of considerable power. She brought it to people she believed would help her. They did not help her. They helped him instead. He paused. The city outside the window continued its indifferent business. "I was in Edinburgh on a matter I believed was more strategically urgent. By the time I returned," another pause. Shorter, harder. "By the time I returned, it was too late." He turned from the window. His face was composed, perfectly, professionally composed. But his eyes held something that had no interest in composure. Something old and unresolved and ferocious in its refusal to be finished. "I have spent 8 years making sure that the system which killed her has considerably less room to operate," he said. "It is not finished work. It will not be finished work in my lifetime. But it is work I do not stop." He crossed back to his desk, picked up the ledger, handed it back to her with the deliberate intention of a man returning something that belongs to its rightful owner. "Your brother brought evidence of wrongdoing to those who were supposed to protect him," Blackwell said. "They failed him. You crossed half of London bleeding to make sure that failure did not become permanent." His eyes held hers. "I understand that. Completely." The room held the weight of shared grief like a cathedral holds silence, not erasing it, but giving it walls, giving it somewhere to live that wasn't inside a single person's chest. "What happens now?" Amelia asked. "Now," said the Duke of Blackwell, "we build something Whitehead cannot survive. If you're still here, comment, 'I choose courage.' I'd love to know who's following this journey all the way to the end." The weeks that followed were unlike any Amelia had known. Not quiet. Nothing in Blackwell's orbit was quiet, but purposeful in a way that felt, for the first time in 2 years of grinding, lonely vigilance, like standing on solid ground rather than perpetually falling. She learned the shape of his world in the way one learns the layout of a new city. Through movement, through wrong turns, through the gradual accumulation of landmarks. Blackwell's influence was not the influence of a title and an estate and a seat in the Lords, though he had all of those things. It was something older and less visible and considerably more effective. He occupied a position in England's true architecture of power, the infrastructure beneath the official structure, the web of obligation and information, and carefully maintained leverage that determined what actually happened versus what was publicly announced as happening. He had been building this for 8 years, since his sister. Every night, Joshua brought reports, Whitehead's movements, his associates, the judges he had purchased, the men he had paid to eliminate witnesses, the political allies who believed themselves safely distant from his crimes, and were about to discover the significant limitations of that belief. Every night, Blackwell absorbed these reports and added to the structure being assembled for Whitehead's destruction. And every night, before Joshua arrived, there was an hour. She could not have said when it became a ritual. Perhaps it always had been, and she had only gradually become aware of it. An hour in the study before the evening's work began, where the fire burned and the day's formality receded by a degree too small to name, but too significant to miss, where she read and he worked, and the silence between them became something other than empty. He did not speak of his sister again, but she was present in the room the way important absences always are, in the particular care he took, in the speed with which he moved on threats to Amelia's safety, in the way his eyes found her across a room with the reflexive, unconscious frequency of a man, checking that something valuable was still where he had left it. She noticed all of it. She said nothing. She was still learning to trust the ground beneath her feet. It was during the 3rd week that Joshua brought news that changed the quality of the air in the manor. Whitehead was not merely hunting Amelia. He had extended his reach. "He's approached Blackwell's political rivals," Joshua said, spreading a series of documents across the study desk. "Specifically, Lord Vane and the Pemberton faction. He's offering them information he claims will neutralize you, Your Grace." Permanently. Blackwell picked up one of the documents. Read it without visible reaction. Set it down. "He's turned this into something larger than a missing ledger," he said. "He's building an alliance," Joshua confirmed. "Men who want Blackwell removed from his position. Whitehead has given them a reason to move." Amelia, seated near the fire, looked up from the document she had been reviewing. "He's using me as leverage. My survival, my presence here. He's framing it as evidence of something. Some conspiracy, yes." Blackwell looked at her. "He's made your protection of me into a political liability." "He has attempted to," Blackwell said, with the particular precision of a man distinguishing between the attempt and the achievement. "That means he's coming," Amelia said, not as a question. "He is already moving," Joshua said. "We believe within the fortnight." The room absorbed this. Amelia set down her document, looked at the fire for a moment with the focused stillness of someone arriving at a decision that had been forming for some time, and had only now found its proper shape. She looked at Blackwell. I want to be useful," she said. "Not protected, useful. Tell me what I can do." He studied her. The firelight found the angles of his face and made them sharper, older, more honest than daylight allowed. "You already are useful," he said. "The ledger. The ledger is evidence. I am more than evidence." She held his gaze. "I know Whitehead. I know how he thinks. I know every person in his social circle, every dinner party, every alliance he values, and every weakness he hides. I spent 2 years inside his world, performing obedience while watching everything." She paused. "Use that." A long silence. Then Joshua, with the careful neutrality of a man who had worked for Blackwell long enough to know when the scales had just shifted. "She's right, Your Grace." Blackwell looked at Joshua, back at Amelia. Something in his expression moved, not dramatically, but definitively. "Very well," he said. "Sit down. Let's begin." The attack came on a Tuesday, which was, Amelia would later reflect, exactly the kind of thing Whitehead would do. Choose an ordinary day, a Tuesday, because extraordinary violence lands harder when it shatters the mundane. She had been in the study for 2 hours, working through Whitehead's network of judicial bribes with Joshua and a quiet, precise man named Alderton who had something to do with the Foreign Office and never fully explained which part. Blackwell had left an hour prior for a meeting in another wing of the estate. A meeting with one of the parliamentary contacts, whose carefully cultivated testimony would form the legal cornerstone of Whitehead's public exposure. They heard the first gunshot at 2:30, then the second, then, from somewhere below, the particular sound of breaking glass that is not accidental. Amelia was on her feet before Joshua finished standing. Alderton moved to the window, looked down, said one quiet word that needed no elaboration. "Armed. How many?" Joshua, already at the door. "More than 4. Joshua looked at Amelia, the reflexive look of a man calculating protection logistics. She looked back at him with the expression of a woman who had finished being calculated. "Where is he?" she said. "My lady." "Where is he, Joshua?" A beat. Joshua recognized something in her face. Something that had not been there 6 weeks ago when he had tried to lift a ledger from the arms of a dying woman in a rain-soaked alley. Something forged in the intervening weeks from grief and purpose and the specific transformation that occurs when a person decides, completely and without reservation, that their story does not end as someone else's footnote. "East Corridor," Joshua said. "The blue reception room." She moved. The manor was controlled chaos. Staff moving with the disciplined urgency of a household that had been prepared for threat. Security measures activating with the quiet efficiency of plans laid long in advance. Blackwell had not built a fortress by accident. But the men who had come tonight were not ordinary hired violence. These were organized, coordinated. They had inside knowledge of the estate's layout that could only have come from someone who had studied it. Whitehead had spent money, time, considerable planning. He had decided that the Duke of Blackwell needed to end tonight. Amelia moved through smoke. Something was burning in the east wing. Not catastrophically, not yet, but the smell was thick, and the light through the windows had taken on an orange quality that had nothing to do with sunset. She passed 2 of Blackwell's men running in the opposite direction and received no challenge, because in this house she had become, over 6 weeks, someone who moved through its spaces with the authority of belonging. She reached the blue reception room. The door was barricaded from within. She knocked in the pattern Joshua had taught her, one of a dozen small protocols embedded into her daily life that she had absorbed without fully understanding until this exact moment. The door opened. Blackwell stood in the center of the room with the contained, absolute calm of a man who was dangerous in direct proportion to how still he became. His coat was gone. There was blood on his left sleeve. Not arterial, not severe, but present. 2 of his men flanked him. One had a pistol trained on the room's second door, the other held a blade. Blackwell looked at her, the precise expression that crossed his face in that moment. Before control reimposed itself, before the Duke reasserted himself over the man, was not something she would ever fully describe. But she would remember it for the rest of her life, the involuntary, unguarded, absolute quality of it. Relief, raw and undefended and entirely unlike him. "You should be in the North Wing," he said. "The North Wing is where they want me," she said, moving into the room. Joshua confirmed they have someone posted there. "It's a trap." She looked at his arm. "How bad? Irrelevant." "It is entirely relevant." She crossed to him. He allowed it, the assessment, the checking, the quiet practicality of it, with the particular stillness of a man who was not accustomed to being attended to and did not know what to do with. The sensation accept, remain motionless and permit it. "The man who organized tonight's entry," she said, pressing a folded cloth from the room's writing desk against the wound with steady hands, "used information about the estate that Whitehead's people could only have from one source. Someone in contact with the parliamentary meeting you held last week. The Pemberton faction." She looked up. Vane didn't just broker a conversation. He gave them a floor plan. Blackwell's eyes sharpened. "I know," she continued, "because I've been through every document in Whitehead's network twice over, and Lord Vane's secretary has a brother who is a surveyor who was contracted for estate work in this building 4 years ago. I toted it 3 days ago and thought it merely interesting. It is now relevant." A beat. Joshua's voice came from behind her, from the doorway. "East entry is secure. We have 2 of theirs in custody. The fire is contained." Blackwell did not look at Joshua. He looked at Amelia. "The secretary's brother," he said. "You have his name?" "I have his name, his address, and his contract records," she said. "All documented. Something happened then in the room. Something that had nothing to do with the siege or the smoke or the blood on his sleeve. Something quieter and more significant than all of it." Blackwell raised his uninjured hand, and with a deliberateness that suggested considerable internal negotiation, placed it over hers where she still held the cloth against his arm. Not moving her hand, not removing it, simply covering it. "Amelia," he said. Her name, just her name, in a voice stripped of its usual professional precision, carrying something underneath that the precision had been covering for weeks. She looked at him. The room was smoke and firelight, and the distant sounds of an attack being brought to order. The world outside this specific moment was loud and dangerous and enormously consequential. Neither of them moved. "You came to find me," he said. "Yes. You knew it might be a trap." "Yes. Why?" She held his gaze. Let the answer carry the full weight of what it meant. "Because you would have come for me," she said simply. The hand over hers pressed very slightly closer. What followed was not swift. Justice rarely is when it is done properly. When it is built to last. When its foundations are laid not in emotion but in evidence, in strategy, in the patient, methodical assembly of truth into a structure that cannot be dismantled by the men it is designed to bury. Blackwell had been building that structure for years. Now he simply added Whitehead's name to the cornerstone. The ledger was authenticated by 3 independent legal authorities, none of whom knew the others were involved. The signed confession, Nathan Holt removed, problem resolved, estate transferred, was witnessed and notarized, and entered into the official record with the quiet, devastating efficiency of an organization that operated several levels above the courts Whitehead had purchased. The judges fell first. 3 of them, presented with the precise documentation of their corruption and the very clear choice between cooperation and exposure, chose cooperation with the alacrity of men who had always, underneath the robes and the authority, been fundamentally afraid of consequence. The parliamentary allies followed, Lord Vane among them, his secretary's brother's name delivered to the appropriate authorities with a specificity that left no room for alternative interpretation. Whitehead felt it coming. Amelia knew that because she knew him, because she had spent 2 years in his house watching the precise micro-expressions of a man constantly calculating his own safety. She had people watching him now, Joshua's people, quiet and effective, and the reports described a man who had begun sleeping poorly, who had dismissed 3 servants on grounds that suggested paranoia, who had stopped attending his customary club appearances. He was afraid. Good, he should be. The public moment came on a Friday, which again, Amelia would later reflect, was exactly right. Not a Tuesday this time, not something ordinary and unsuspecting. A Friday at the Session of Lords in the full company of England's political establishment, in the room where men like Whitehead had always believed their power was at its most absolute. Amelia was not present in the chamber. Women were not, in that time and in that place, granted that particular presence. But she sat in the carriage outside with the ledger in her lap and Joshua beside, her and her hands perfectly steady, listening to the city go about its November business. Blackwell was inside. The session had been running for an hour when she heard it. The particular quality of sound that travels from a building through its walls when something irreversible has just been said in front of everyone who matters. 30 minutes later, the doors opened. Whitehead came out first, not under his own volition, accompanied by men whose presence required no explanation. His face was the face of a man from whom certainty has been permanently removed, not angry, not defiant, just diminished, collapsed inward. The face of someone who has just discovered that the world they believed they controlled has been, for some time, operating under entirely different management. He did not see her in the carriage, or perhaps he did, and could not sustain the act of looking. Blackwell emerged 10 minutes later, descended the steps with the unhurried certainty of a man for whom this outcome had never been in serious question, crossed the courtyard, opened the carriage door himself. He looked at her, she looked at him. "It's done," he said, 2 words, quiet as the resolution of something that has taken 8 years to finish, that has cost more than a name on a ledger, that has carried the weight of a dead sister and a murdered brother and 2 people who found each other at the bottom of a rain-soaked alley and chose together not to stay there. Amelia closed her eyes, opened them. "The inheritance?" she asked. "Restoration proceedings begin Monday. Your solicitor, the legitimate one, not Whitehead's, has already been contacted." A pause. "Holt House is yours." She absorbed this, the weight of it. Nathan's house, her father's house, the house she had been locked out of by a man who had believed his forgeries were flawless. And Whitehead? He will stand trial. The confession alone is sufficient. The rest. Blackwell glanced once, briefly, at the doors through which Whitehead had been escorted. The rest will ensure that every room he might have fled to is closed to him before he finds the door. The carriage began to move. For a while, neither of them spoke. London scrolled past the window, ordinary, indifferent, magnificent London, with its rain and its commerce, and its total lack of interest in individual stories, regardless of their significance. "My sister's name was Catherine," Blackwell said. Amelia turned to look at him. He was looking at the window, at the city, at something beyond it. She liked histories, old ones, civilizations that no longer existed. A long pause. She believed they always had something useful to teach the present. The breath Amelia drew was slow and quiet. "So did Nathan," she said. Blackwell turned from the window, looked at her with eyes that had, somewhere in the last several weeks, stopped keeping their distance. "I know," he said. "You told me the first morning." She had not realized he had held that detail, that he had kept it, somewhere beneath the strategy and the authority and the professional composure, that he had carried her brother's particular love of old histories as something worth remembering. She reached across the carriage, placed her hand over his. He looked down at it, then up at her, did not move away. "What happens now?" she asked, the same question she had asked him in the study, weeks ago, when the world had been fully against them, and the structure of justice had been only a blueprint. He turned his hand beneath hers, a deliberate motion. His fingers closed around hers with the careful, irrevocable quality of a man doing something he intends to mean. "Now," said the Duke of Blackwell, "you stop being someone I protect and become someone I choose." Spring came to London the way it always does, gradually, then suddenly, as if the city had been holding its breath through winter and finally remembered it was allowed to exhalt. Holt House was restored to its proper ownership on the 17th of March. Amelia walked through its rooms on a Tuesday morning, Tuesdays having been rehabilitated in her estimation, with the quiet, unhurried attention of someone reclaiming something that was always theirs, running her hand along the window sills of her childhood, standing in Nathan's library with its shelves of ancient histories and allowing the grief and the love of it to exist together, as they would always exist together, inseparable and hers. She did not walk through it alone. Blackwell stood in the doorway of Nathan's library and said nothing, because nothing was required. His presence was the thing, steady, warm in the specific way that very controlled men are warm when they choose to be, like sunlight through heavy glass. She turned from the shelves and looked at him. "He would have liked you," she said. Would he? He had an instinct for people who meant what they said. She looked at the books. He was usually right. Blackwell crossed the room, came to stand beside her, shoulder to shoulder, looking at the books with the quiet respect of a man, standing in the room of someone he never met and already understands. "I have a question," he said. "Ask it." He turned to look at her. In the library's morning light she had never quite adjusted to this, to the discrepancy between the man England feared and the man she had come to know, simply himself. The armor present but worn loosely, the distance gone. "I have spent 8 years building something," he said, "that was designed to operate without attachment, without the complication of—" He paused, chose the word with unusual care. "Vulnerability." "I know," she said. "You have made that considerably more difficult." "I know. I find," he continued, "that I am not as troubled by this as I expected to be." The corner of her mouth moved. That may be the most restrained declaration in the history of the English language. Something in his face shifted. Something that had started shifting in a rain-soaked carriage outside the House of Lords and had been completing itself ever since. He reached into his coat, produced a ring, old, elegant, bearing the Blackwell seal, and held it with the directness of a man who had made his decision and saw no reason to obscure it in ceremony. "Amelia Holt," he said, "you are the most formidable person I have encountered in 41 years of encountering people. You held evidence of treason against your chest while bleeding to death in an alley, rather than let it go. You walked into a burning corridor to find me. You dismantled a man's criminal network using his own documents while recovering from broken ribs." He looked at her with eyes that held nothing in reserve. "I would like very much for you to be the Duchess of Blackwell, not because you need protection, because I cannot imagine this work, any of it, without you beside me doing it." She looked at the ring, at him, at the library, where her brother's books waited on their shelves, patient and beloved, and proof that the things we love do not disappear simply because they are taken from us. They wait in the rooms that held them for us to find our way back. Yes, she said, not because she needed saving, because she chose him. The distinction mattered to both of them. He placed the ring on her finger with the careful, certain hands of a man who had not offered this to anyone, and intended it to mean everything it meant. Outside the library windows, London went about its spring business, the horse-drawn carriages and the street vendors and the river, glinting silver in the morning light, the city enormous and indifferent and utterly unaware that in a house on its north side, a woman who had been left for dead in one of its alleys was standing in her brother's library wearing the ring of England's most powerful duke, and feeling, for the first time in longer than she could precisely calculate, like the full and undiminished version of herself. Lord Brooks Whitehead stood trial in June. He was convicted on 6 counts, including the murder of Nathan Holt, of which he was found guilty on the strength of 8 words written in his own hand, in his own ledger, hidden in his own wall. Nathan Holt removed, problem resolved, estate transferred. The court was silent when those words were read aloud, the kind of silence that is not absence of sound but presence of weight. Whitehead was stripped of his titles, his holdings, and his freedom. The men who had purchased influence through him fell in sequence, each one's cooperation with authorities ensuring the next one's exposure, a chain reaction of accountability that had been set in motion by a woman with broken ribs in a rain-soaked alley who had refused, at every subsequent step, to let go. The Duchess of Blackwell attended every day of the trial. She sat in the gallery with her spine straight and her hands in her lap, and the particular expression of a woman who has waited a long time for truth to be said aloud in a room that could not ignore it. She did not celebrate. She did not perform satisfaction. She simply witnessed. For Nathan, for Catherine Blackwell, for every person whose name appeared in that ledger as a problem resolved, a witness eliminated, a life reduced to a line item by a man supremely confident in his own permanence. On the day of sentencing, Blackwell sat beside her. His hand found hers when the verdict was read. She held it without looking at him, because she was looking at Whitehead, at the face of the man who had miscalculated so completely, who had seen a grieving young woman performing obedience, and believed that was all she was, that it was all she would ever be. He looked at her as they led him out. She met his eyes and did not look away. Then he was gone, and the room exhaled, and Blackwell's hand tightened around hers, and she turned to look at him, and he looked back at her with the eyes of a man who had spent 8 years doing necessary, exhausting, righteous work, and had not until recently had someone to look at when it was finished. "Catherine would have been pleased," he said quietly. "Nathan too," she said. They left the court together. Into London's summer light, into the city's magnificent indifference, into a life that had been built from ruin and evidence, and the absolute refusal of 2 people to accept that. What had been done to them was the final word on who they were. It is a particular kind of strength, the kind that cannot be manufactured, that cannot be inherited or purchased or granted by title, that survives what is designed to destroy it. Lord Whitehead had believed he was burying Amelia Holt when he left her in that alley. He was not burying her. He was simply failing to understand that some things, pressed into the dark and the cold and the mud, do not decay. They wait. They gather what they need, and then they rise. And what they become in the rising is always more powerful than what they were before the fall, because they carry the knowledge now, in their bones and their blood and their unbreakable hands, that they have already survived the worst thing. And everything after that is simply the rest of the story still being written, still unfolding, still magnificent in its insistence on continuing. Lady Amelia Holt was left for dead in a London alley on a November night. She rose as the Duchess of Blackwell, and England, which had watched without intervening, had the good sense to take note. If this story touched your heart, let me know where you're watching from and what part stayed with you the most. And if you enjoy powerful stories of love, resilience, redemption, and second chances, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next journey.